Hello, I'm Alan Story, Chief Product Officer for Interseed, and I've spent the last 20 years helping large enterprises and governments deploy strong authentication to protect themselves against data breach, protect their information, protect their assets. One of the things we're seeing at the moment with our customer base is they're starting to look at how do I roll authentication out further? How do I go the extra mile? How do I protect everything? And a number of them are starting to look at FIDO as a possibility for increasing that strength of authentication in their deployments. So in this particular session, I'm going to have a look at some of the design concepts behind FIDO, privacy and security. And what do enterprises expect? What have they been doing over the last 10, 15 years? And really, how does FIDO fit into that environment? Is it suitable for use in that managed enterprise environment? And finally, I'm going to look at something that a number of our customers are looking for, which is a hybrid approach to try to take the best of both worlds, existing authentication mechanisms and modern passwordless authentication. So let's start with one of the main design concepts of FIDO, the back to the basics in effect. So this is the security with the privacy. So with FIDO, we have the private key on the device. We have the public key in the relying party that's bound to that particular account within that relying party. But there's nothing that really binds the person to that authenticator or that key. That job is done purely by that relying party. Now, the private public key makes it super secure, so that's really good. We don't have any shared secrets to lose. We don't have any one-time passwords that can be stolen. So we very much like the security of that. When we have more than one relying party, we have an additional key pair. So if I'm authenticating to my bank or my e-commerce provider or my network provider, I have a new key pair for each of those relying parties. And that's where the privacy really comes from. So each of those parties doesn't know anything about the credentials I use to access the other party. And that's what I want. I don't want my bank to know anything about my credentials from my network provider, for example. So that's the security with the privacy. We have very high levels of security, and there's nothing really that's binding that individual to that authenticator or to that credential other than the relying party itself. That's where that knowledge lives. So let's contrast that to a typical authentication experience within the enterprise. This example is using a PKI-based smart card. So that may well be used for physical access into the building and then logical access, logging onto the network, logging onto Windows, etc. Some similarities. Here we have a private public key. So we have the private key generated on the device, never leaves the device, same as FIDO, so that's nice and secure. But in this case, the public key doesn't belong within the relying party. It's issued by a trusted authority, a certificate authority, and that goes into an actual certificate. So this is where the main difference lies. That certificate has the name of the person. It has a certificate revocation list. So that means, can I check if this certificate is still valid? Has this been revoked? And it has the certificate of the actual issuance authority. So what this allows you to do is the relying parties can verify, did that certificate actually get issued by a trusted authority? Is it one I can trust? What this allows you to do in a PKI environment is mean that the relying party, the system you're authenticating to, doesn't actually need to have the credential within its own system. It can actually get that credential from that certificate and it can validate it came from a trusted authority. The authentication of the process itself is the same. So you can have a random challenge. It can be digitally signed by the private key on the device. It can be verified by the public key. But in this example, it means you can use that public key in the certificate, single private key, to authenticate to multiple backend systems. So that this is how organizations have been authenticating within the enterprise. This is really starting to lay some of the groundwork for what those enterprises expect. Because we have that certificate there that binds it to a person, we also have organizations that have onboarding policies for people. So we've all been through this when we join a new organization. Somebody verifies our identity. They might do reference checks. They might do background checks. We know that this person is who they claim to be, and then we issue them a credential to access the corporate and the enterprise resources. So that could come in simply from a directory, could be linked up to Active Directory. It could come in from an identity management system, something like SailPoint that's used to drive those onboarding processes. And we could have people involved. So the line manager or the HR person issues that credential to that individual, giving them access to those environments. Typically, a credential management system, such as our MyID product, is involved there, connecting these systems together. So connecting to the certificate authority, lots of key management on devices. There's also a lot of policy control here. So the larger and more complex an organization is, the greater need they have for issuing different types of identities. So for example, workers in the office may be given a physical smart card face-to-face. Remote workers may be self-collecting a certificate onto a USB token, as may contractors. So that process is very much binding that credential to that person. So when somebody authenticates, their identity is carried with that credential, and that can be validated, which is different to the FIDO approach. The second difference we see here is device binding. So that credential is on a specific device. So when somebody authenticates, we know what device that credential is on and who's actually using that credential and that device. So the smart cards, for example, typically have a unique serial number, and that can be bound and tied to that account at the point of issuance. Can also be used for audit and traceability. So when somebody authenticates to a system, you can look at which particular device they used to do that. If you need to revoke it, if they've left the organization, it gives you a simple handle for doing that. It also starts to tie into some of the management capabilities. So if you know what particular device is being used, you can have management keys, you can handle revocation, for example. So we have the credential bound to a person and we have it bound to a device. Because of that, we can provide lifecycle management. So a certificate has an expiry date. You can issue a 3-year certificate, you can issue a 1-year certificate. Some of our employees, some of our organizations have employees who work for a 6-month period or 12-month period. So you can issue them a certificate that only lasts for that 6 months. After that time, it will expire, it will no longer be valid. So that's a slightly additional concept to the FIDO approach, where it's the relying party's job to understand that. So you can issue credentials with a lifetime. Because they have a lifetime, you can also update them. So for example, you could issue a 5-year smart card, you could have a 3-year certificate. 3 years in, you need to collect a new certificate onto that smart card. You also may need to issue additional smart cards. So you could start just with authentication, but you might want an additional credential on that device for signing or email encryption. We also have the concept of unlock. So if I enter a PIN incorrectly a number of times into the device, it will unlock. The PKI card allows you to unlock that credential by entering a secure key, a challenge response mechanism to unlock the credential, which means you don't need to reissue the credentials. And you also have that revocation. So importantly, if somebody leaves the organization, their account becomes disabled in the directory or SailPoint or an IDMS sends an instruction, we can simply revoke that. So the reason I'm talking about these is these really set the scene for what do enterprises expect from authentication and credentials and devices. The final part of this one is the auditing and reporting. So a lot of the customers need to comply with legislation, HIPAA in healthcare, Sarbanes-Oxley, FIPS 201 in government, and they have to know who is accessing their systems. When they get audited for this, they have to be able to show who issued what to who approved it, when were the credentials actually used, when were they revoked, etc. So people expect this to go into a central signed and verifiable audit. So typically the audit is signed with the PKI credentials themselves. So Alan's been talking for a while now, and he hasn't really mentioned FIDO. Isn't this supposed to be a FIDO Authenticate conference? Yes, it is. What I've been really talking about is to try and set the scene for what enterprises, what our customers expect from credential management and strong authentication. And when they start looking at FIDO, it's a bit of a mindset change to the way it works. So what I'm now going to do is look through some of those capabilities that enterprises expect and map FIDO to them to see if FIDO fits. Does FIDO stack up in the enterprise? The first one is person binding. So the classic FIDO approach, where you have the relying party holding the public key, that becomes difficult to bind it to an individual. But there is a solution here. So our product, MyID, the credential management system, and other systems can do this as well, can act as an identity provider. So they can bind that device to a person. In that case, when somebody issues somebody a new FIDO authenticator, when the key pair is generated, that key is held within that identity provider. So it's not held on the relying party, and that identity provider or authentication server, for want of another expression, provides identity and authentication services to those parties. So you can have multiple parties calling into that single system for identification. So that really is a federated approach. And that works, and that's very, very traditional with the way authentication systems have worked for a long time. So that's possible. You can also then, because it's the credential management system issuing the authenticator, start to have policies around it. This particular person needs approving, this remote worker can manage this via self-service, other people have to collect this face-to-face, this one goes on a hardware authenticator, this one's allowed on a software authenticator. So you get those policies and those control over it. And again, this is all about integrating it into those enterprise environments, the systems they're used to. Enterprises don't like changing their systems that they've been working with for a long time. So you can do this with people, you can drive it via APIs, you can hook it up to the LDAP as the source of trusted data. So yes, FIDO works in this environment if you're using an authentication server to provide that FIDO experience. Device binding is a little different. So the principle of FIDO is that there isn't a unique identifier to the device. You get privacy, you don't get traceability of that device. But some of the changes coming in the FIDO standard around WebAuthn, CTAP 2.1, client to authenticated protocol, introduce the concept of enterprise attestation. What that really means is that the device can have a unique authenticator. Now that's interesting. That starts to open up the possibilities I was mentioning about binding that device to the person. So for example, at the moment with our system, if we issue a PKI credential to somebody and a FIDO key to somebody, those can be on the same device, the same physical device. But we don't know they're on the same device because we don't have a way of tying that to the device with FIDO. Enterprise attestation gives us that ability. So that starts to introduce the possibility of having a single point of revocation. Somebody leaves the organization or they lose their authenticator device, we can revoke the PKI, we can revoke the FIDO key so they're no longer valid. So that starts to meet the expectations of enterprises in this space. What we need to see is how many of the FIDO authenticator vendors introduce this and how are they going to introduce it. So we're having those conversations with some of the vendors in this space at the moment. Will it be a separate identifier to the classic smart card identifier? Will it be a new one for FIDO? Will it be a combined one? So this is quite interesting, and it certainly opens up possibilities for not only managing delivery of credentials to a specific device, but also for tracking and tracing where they were actually used for authentication purposes, which helps with the audit. In terms of lifecycle management, there's a mix. So yes, we can have lifecycle management if you're using that credential management system. So for example, we can issue a FIDO key. The FIDO key itself won't have an expiry, but within that credential management system, acting as an identity provider, you can say this key is valid for 3 months, this key is valid for 6 months. So you can actually, after that point, block the authentication from happening. So yes, that's possible, but that happens within that system. Updates are possible. So if you need to rekey a device for a particular reason, you can do that. You can create jobs that are collected by self-service, typically by the individual. Unlock is slightly more challenging. So there isn't within the FIDO specification today that ability to unlock a PIN. If I put a PIN in incorrectly a certain number of times, the device is blocked. So I can't do an unlock on that device. There is a workaround though. So what we can do is simply reissue that authentication credential. So we can wipe the authenticator, we can reissue that credential and a new key into that particular token. So that works as a workaround for that. And revocation, again, can be provided as long as you're using that authentication server to be the identity provider. So it's providing authentication services to multiple relying parties. That way it can get a revocation request, it can revoke the credential, and none of the relying parties that use it will be able to use it for authentication anymore. And that's quite important for enterprise deployments. Auditing and reporting, yes. So the CMS, the credential management system, will know this person issued this FIDO credential to this individual at this point in time. So you've got the audit trail. In terms of usage, that really comes down to that enterprise attestation. So if we can start to have that identifier on the device, we know which specific device is used, we can then use that to trace it across multiple services and multiple relying parties. Same for that signed and verifiable audit. So the identity provider can place in its audit trail, and that can be signed, which particular authentication happened at what time, to what system. But if we need to bind that to a particular device, that's where we need that enterprise attestation. So again, that's a very interesting area and very relevant to enterprises. So where do we leave us? We have organizations, enterprises who've come from a PKI background, the sort of high security. They're looking at deploying wider authentication to every endpoint, every person, even potentially down the supply chain. FIDO fits for a number of the use cases. PKI fits for a number of the use cases, but neither alone solves every use case the enterprises have. So what we're seeing is a number of our customers starting to look for a mix of PKI and FIDO. So this isn't really PKI versus FIDO, it's PKI and FIDO. And the reason for that is having to roll out that authentication to every endpoint device, every person, is difficult if you're just using one of the technologies. So PKI works very well for some scenarios. If I have an existing application that's already PKI enabled, VPN, remote access, network logon, that works very well. Signed and encrypted email works very well for PKI. I can digitally sign a document, somebody can verify it, they can make sure it was actually me that sent it. So it's good protection against phishing, for example. Some of our government customers are looking at high security PKI at the door. Works well for document signing, anything where you need to verify that signature after the event without having access to the relying party in the first place. So because of the fact that the public key travels with the certificate, you can verify it after the event. So that's why it's used for things like eIDAS signing in Europe. That's why a lot of blockchain systems use digitally signed PKI records into the blockchain. Where you have a physical device that has a smart card reader or a USB, then that can work quite well for the tokens. However, it doesn't work for everything. So there are examples where FIDO fits much better. Legacy applications. Some of our customers in healthcare, for example, have systems that are quite old and quite bespoke, and they're very difficult to PKI enable. But if you're looking at something like WebAuthn, one of the modern protocols, it's much easier to enable those for strong authentication. SaaS applications where the organization isn't in control of that end environment. So if you're using Salesforce to manage your customers, it's very difficult to PKI enable that because you can't turn to Salesforce and say, please switch on PKI in this environment. No, it's a modern application. That's not how it's designed. But it's easier to use modern application mechanisms to get to it. Bring your own device scenarios or devices where you haven't got card readers or USB slots. So with the pandemic, a lot more people working from home, potentially using their own devices. If I'm using a laptop, then a USB reader will probably be there. If I'm using an iPad, it's very difficult to use PKI on a device for that environment. But with WebAuthn, because CTAP 2.1 is built into that device, then I don't need to deploy any software to it. I can use my FIDO authenticator with NFC. I can authenticate over those environments, which makes it much easier to deploy and use. And finally, where we have contractors, temporary workers, remote workers, and supply chain, where as an enterprise, I'm not in control of the onboarding experience necessarily of those people if they're outsourced, it's very difficult to roll out PKI to them. PKI has a lot of policy around certificate practice statements, certificate policy statements, proving and knowing who those people are. So the policy as well as the technology can make it difficult to roll that out to more remote workers. FIDO kind of removes that problem because it doesn't have those policy constraints. So it's much more within the control of the enterprise to fit within their systems. So we're really starting to see this pattern of organizations looking at a hybrid approach of traditional authentication mechanisms and modern authentication mechanisms. So what could that look like? What does that hybrid approach actually look like? What we're seeing is that there's a number of building blocks to this solution. So the first one is the identity infrastructure within the enterprise. So that could be a directory, a source of user data, could be an identity management system that's passing onboarding requests, revocation requests, requests for credentials to people. We have the credential management system, such as our MyID product, that's responsible for both issuing those credentials, be they PKI or FIDO, and acting as a FIDO2 server, so providing identity services to the relying parties. And in a PKI environment, we have the certificate authority. We have operators. So these are people who, line managers, HR people, security administrators, who issue and manage credentials to end users. And we have the help desk operators who help people if they've lost or forgotten or locked their devices. We have the end users themselves. So these are the people who were issued the credentials who want to access the corporate resources. In terms of access, we have a number of device form factors. Could be a physical smart card. A number of manufacturers now here are introducing FIDO onto those devices. So you can see them as FIDO-approved devices. We have the USB tokens, potentially with the NFC capability. And we have the actual soft capabilities built into the mobile devices. Sometimes we see those used to actually authenticate via a third-party device. So it could be a smart card in a laptop. It could be a USB device using on a laptop or NFC, on an iPad or an Android token. Or it could be actually direct from the phone using the soft credential. And you're accessing multiple back-end systems here with that single credential. The reason you can do that is that those have those hooks back into that identity infrastructure. So that could be to validate the PKI certificate, it's not been revoked. It could be to use the credential management system as an identity provider for that FIDO authentication. So this is the sort of infrastructure we're starting to see customers build, combining the strong authentication capabilities of FIDO with the traditional PKI infrastructure and making use of fairly typical authentication protocols such as OAuth and OpenID Connect to actually bind the worlds of WebAuthn and authentication in the enterprise together. So the simple answer from our perspective is yes, FIDO is relevant to the enterprise. It can fit into that enterprise space, but it needs to be adapted to work within the infrastructure that's already present. This is what some of our customers are looking to do. How can I move that in there? How can I adopt the modern authentication and make it fit within my environment? So if you want to find out any more about how we're working in this space and what some of our customers are doing, visit our website, send us an email. We'd love to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of FIDO Authenticate.